The first explosion ripped the sky in half. The second tore the Hopebringer out of it. Dr. Elias Voss barely had time to register the warning klaxons before the medical transport ship was spinning, fire tearing through its aft engines. The artificial gravity failed, sending bodies hurtling through the air like broken marionettes. Someone screamed. Someone else was already dead then. Impact. Elias awoke to the taste of blood and smoke, his ears ringing. The emergency lights flickered, casting the ruined interior of the Hopebringer in hellish red. He struggled to sit up, his body protesting with sharp, unforgiving pain. His mind snapped back to the mission: evacuate wounded civilians from Vardros 7, neutral ground, non-combat zone. That was the agreement. That was supposed to be the law, but war had no laws. Through the shattered viewport, he saw the battlefield stretching for miles. The sky burned with tracer fire and falling debris, the distant mountain ridges obscured by smoke and death. The bodies of his fellow medical crew lay around him, some motionless, some barely clinging to life. That he forced himself upright, staggering to his feet. No time to grieve. No time to think. Just move. That he grabbed his emergency medkit and checked the life signs of those closest to him. Most were beyond saving. The few that weren't needed immediate attention. He worked fast, hands steady despite the chaos outside. Sutures, stimulants, clotting agents. He could still save. A guttural snarl behind him. Elias turned, muscles locking in place. .3 towering figures stood at the breach of the ruined hull. Kael'vara, battle-scarred and bloodied. Their exoskeletal armor gleamed under the firelit sky. Predatory eyes locked onto him, their clawed hands gripping plasma rifles, survivors of the battlefield. And they had found him. Elias raised his hand slowly. I'm unarmed. A doctor. The tallest Kael'vara, deep crimson markings across his chitinous skin, snarled something in their native tongue. Another barked in galactic common. That you're the one who saved the dying? Elias hesitated. Yes. The lead warrior took a step forward, his mandibles twitching. Then you will fix us, or we will rip you apart. Elias exhaled. Of course, that he had no weapon, no soldiers to protect him. Only his hands, his skill, and his ability to prove that his presence was worth more alive than dead. Fine, he said, kneeling next to the first injured Kael'vara. But if you want to live, shut up and let me work. Outside, the war raged on. But inside the wreckage of the Hopebringer, a human doctor had just been drafted into it. Elias had treated some strange patients in his time. He'd worked in off-world colonies where humans and aliens mingled, where xenobiology textbooks were more important than scalpel precision. But nothing had prepared him for the Kael'vara. Their blood wasn't just dark. It shimmered like liquid metal, thick and slow to clot. Their bones weren't made of calcium, but something closer to carbon fiber, flexible yet nearly impossible to break. And their nervous system? A labyrinth of redundancies, secondary pain receptors firing in ways he barely understood. Yet, despite all of this, they bled. They suffered. And they died, just like anyone else. The Kael'vara warrior in front of him, a 7-foot mass of muscle, exoskeletal plating, and deep lacerations, growled as Elias worked. His mandibles twitched, clicking in irritation every time the human's tools pressed against his wounds. Hold still, Elias muttered. He adjusted the sealant injector and pressed it against a deep gash on the warrior's abdomen. The biopolymer hissed as it bonded to alien flesh, stabilizing the wound. The warrior hissed in response. This stings that it's better than bleeding out, isn't it? A pause. Then, begrudgingly, yes. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow. The wreckage of the Hopebringer was rapidly becoming a makeshift triage center. More Kael'vara had gathered, limping, wounded, some barely clinging to life. They watched him with unreadable expressions, equal parts curiosity and suspicion, that he wasn't sure if they saw him as a savior or a temporary tool. Probably the latter. Outside, the battle raged on. Explosions shook the ground. The sky above was thick with the flashing contrails of orbital bombardments. The Zorvith Dominion was pushing forward, crushing the Kael'vara resistance, with ruthless precision. If the Kael'vara fell back any further, Elias would be caught in no man's land. Not that it mattered that he wasn't here as a soldier. He was here to keep people alive. Even if those people barely saw him as anything more than an insect. One of the warriors, a female, her exoskeletal plating marred with deep plasma burns, stalked up to him. "You are efficient for a soft creature," she said, voice clicking in her native tongue before translating into galactic common. "Thanks," Elias said. He barely looked up as he moved to the next patient. A Kael'vara male had taken shrapnel to the thigh. If he didn't extract it soon, infection would set in. "But you are wasting time," the female continued. Elias stopped mid-motion. "Excuse me?" She tilted her head, studying him. "That one is already too damaged to fight." She gestured to the Kael'vara soldier beneath him. "You should be focusing on those who can return to battle." Elias clenched his jaw. "I'm not here to make sure you win a war. I'm here to save lives." The female warrior chittered something, a sound that might have been a laugh. "Foolish human. You think life has value beyond war? Beyond strength?" "Yes." Elias forced the shrapnel out with a careful twist of his forceps. The wounded soldier groaned in pain, but didn't move. The female scoffed. "That is why your kind will never survive out here." Elias looked up then, meeting her gaze. "Funny, because right now, I'm the only reason you're still alive." A long silence stretched between them, then another explosion. Closer this time that a Kael'vara scout rushed into the wreckage, panting, armor smeared with dust and blood. "The Zorvith are advancing. They'll be here in minutes." Murmurs spread through the gathered warriors. Weapons were drawn. Clawed fingers tightened around rifle stocks. Elias swore under his breath. He had no gun, no protection, just a rapidly dwindling supply of medical tools and a group of wounded soldiers who were in no condition to fight. The female warrior turned back to him. "You have two choices, human. Stay and fight, or run and die." Elias exhaled. His pulse was hammering, but then he did something that surprised even himself. He stood up, wiped his blood-stained hands on his ruined uniform, and said, "No. I have a third option." The Kael'vara stared. "That I'm going to save whoever I can," Elias said firmly. "Even if it means patching up your enemies." A tense silence followed. The warriors exchanged glances, unreadable expressions flickering across their alien features. Then the female warrior grinned, sharp and knowing. "You might survive out here after all, human." Outside, the war raged on. But inside the wreckage of the Hopebringer, a battle of a different kind had just begun. The Zorvith warriors stormed the battlefield with brutal precision. Their armor, a fusion of plated carapace and advanced nanoweave, shimmered beneath the firelit sky. Each movement was methodical, each strike designed to crush resistance with overwhelming force. The Kael'vara had no chance. Elias crouched low inside the ruined shell of the Hopebringer, gripping the straps of his medkit as the first wave of Zorvith soldiers descended upon them. Plasma bolts seared the air, punching through metal and bone alike. The Kael'vara warriors fought back, but their numbers were too few, their injuries too severe. The blast struck just outside the wreckage, sending shockwaves through the ground. Elias covered his head as shrapnel rained down around him. Then, silence. When he looked up, the battle was over. The Kael'vara survivors lay motionless, some unconscious, others bleeding out in the dirt. A few still twitched, trying to crawl toward weapons they no longer had the strength to wield. The Zorvith commander stepped forward, his armor stained with battle gore. His reptilian eyes locked onto Elias with predatory focus. "You are not Kael'vara," the alien rumbled. His voice was deep, guttural, but laced with an unsettling calm. "No," Elias said, forcing himself to stand. "I'm a doctor." The commander's mandibles twitched. "And yet you chose to aid our enemy." Elias exhaled. He knew what came next. A battlefield execution, most likely. The Zorvith were infamous for their lack of mercy, but then something unexpected happened. One of the wounded Zorvith warriors stumbled forward, clutching a plasma-charred wound in his side. His armor bore the insignia of an elite strike force. His breathing was labored, his claws trembling from blood loss. "Commander," the injured Zorvith rasped. "I require medical assistance." The commander turned to Elias. "Fix him." Elias blinked. "What? You claim to be a doctor," the commander said. "Prove it. Save him." It wasn't a request. Elias hesitated only a moment before his instincts took over. He dropped to his knees beside the injured warrior, scanning the wound. The plasma had burned through layers of organic armor, searing into muscle. It wasn't fatal. "Yet that I need stabilizers," Elias said. "Coagulants, something to counteract tissue degradation." The commander tossed a field medpack at his feet. "Use what you need." Elias didn't waste time. He worked fast, sealing the wound, injecting stabilizers, ensuring the warrior didn't go into shock. The Zorvith's alien physiology was different, but pain was universal. Healing was universal. The injured warrior groaned, his breathing stabilizing. "Until live," Elias said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But he needs proper care." The commander studied him for a long moment. Then, to Elias's utter shock, he turned to his soldiers and barked an order in their native tongue. "Take him." Elias stiffened. "Wait, what?" "You are no longer a prisoner," the commander said. "You are property of the Zorvith Dominion now." The weight of the words settled over Elias like a death sentence. The Kael'vara had wanted to use him. Now, the Zorvith saw his value too, that he wasn't just a doctor anymore, that he was a weapon, and that terrified him more than anything else. Elias sat in the dimly lit interior of the Zorvith Field Command Post, surrounded by creatures that saw him as little more than an asset, a tool. The air was thick with the scent of burned ozone, disinfectant, and blood. Wounded Zorvith warriors lay on crude medical tables, their armor torn, their flesh exposed and raw, seared wounds that he had been given no choice. The Zorvith commander, General Crises, had made it clear. Elias would work, or he would die. The Dominion had suffered more casualties than anticipated in their advance against the Kael'vara. And now, Elias was their only competent battlefield medic, and he had saved one of their warriors. Now, they expected him to save them all. That a Zorvith officer loomed over him, mandibles clicking in irritation. "Faster, human?" Elias barely spared him a glance. "Unless you want me to botch this surgery and kill your man, shut up and let me work." The Zorvith soldier bristled, but Crises raised a clawed hand, signaling silence. The general watched Elias with cold amusement. "You are bold for such a fragile thing." Crises mused. Elias ignored him, focusing on the unconscious warrior on the table. The alien's wound was deep, a jagged tear in his side where plasma fire had eaten through armor and flesh alike. Zorvith biology was a nightmare. Redundant organs, segmented musculature, clotting agents that reacted unpredictably to human medical treatments. But medicine wasn't just about knowledge. It was about instinct. Elias worked with precision, sealing ruptured blood vessels, adjusting the alien's internal fluid balance. Every move was calculated, every cut measured. The moment his hands stopped shaking, he knew he had accepted this new reality, that he was no longer just a doctor, that he was a battlefield necessity. When he finished, the soldiers' breathing steadied. The Zorvith around him murmured in approval. "He will live," Elias said, stepping back. His hands were slick with dark, viscous alien blood. Crises tilted his head, studying him. "Interesting." Elias wiped his hands on a rag. "If you want me to keep working, I need supplies. Sterile conditions. Assistants who actually know what the hell they're doing." The room fell silent. A lesser being demanding resources from the Dominion? Unheard of. Crises laughed, a deep, unsettling sound. "You misunderstand, Doctor. You are here to serve, not to make demands." Elias clenched his jaw. "Then your soldiers will die." The laughter stopped for a long moment. The two of them stared at each other. Then Crises' mandibles twitched in what might have been approval. "Very well. You will have what you need. But understand this, you are only alive because I allow it." Elias exhaled, pushing down the wave of exhaustion pressing at the edges of his mind, that he was in enemy hands, surrounded by killers who valued strength above all else. He had no weapons, no allies, no way out, but he had his knowledge, his skills, and that meant he still had power, that he wasn't a soldier, but in this war, he had just become something far more dangerous. Elias had never been a soldier, but war didn't care. It had swallowed him whole, dragged him across the front lines, and now demanded something he never thought he'd have to give: strategy. The Zorvith Dominion had stopped treating him as a prisoner. That was almost more terrifying than their threats. Prisoners were disposable. Assets were not. General Krezek had stationed him in the heart of their mobile war camp, where wounded soldiers were brought in from the front lines. But Elias wasn't just treating injuries anymore. He was managing casualties, prioritizing resources, and, without realizing it, redesigning their entire approach to battlefield medicine. And the Zorvith were listening. They still didn't trust him. They probably never would. But they had learned one thing. Elias Boss saved more of their warriors than their own damn medics, which meant he had influence, which meant he could change the war. The camp was in chaos. Injured soldiers poured in, their carapace armor scorched, limbs mangled by plasma fire. The Kael'vara had fought back harder than expected, ambushing the Zorvith in a desperate counteroffensive. Elias moved through the carnage with clinical precision. You get him on the table. That one's already in hemorrhagic shock. Start fluids now. A Zorvith medic hesitated. But the warlords, if you waste time arguing with me, your warlords won't have an army left to command. The medic flinched, but obeyed. Elias worked quickly, suturing deep lacerations, stabilizing collapsed lungs, resetting shattered bones. His hands never stopped moving. His mind never stopped calculating. Triage. Prioritize the salvageable. Don't waste resources on the doomed. IT was battlefield medicine at its coldest. IT was survival. And then, the next wave of wounded arrived. But these weren't Zorvith soldiers. They were Kael'vara prisoners. Elias froze as the battered Kael'vara were dragged into the med bay, bound in reinforced restraints. Their armor was stripped, their bodies broken. Some were barely conscious. Others glared at their captors with quiet defiance. That a Zorvith officer turned to Elias. Let them die. Did Elias's stomach twisted. He looked at the prisoners, Kael'vara warriors who had once threatened to kill him, now reduced to the same desperation as their enemies. That he took a slow breath. That no, the officer's mandibles clicked. You do not command here, human. Elias met his gaze without flinching. No, I don't. But I know more about keeping your warriors alive than any of you. And if I stop working, your casualty rate doubles. A long silence. Then, Krezek's voice rumbled from the shadows. Save them. The officer recoiled. General, Krezek cut him off with a simple gesture. If the human believes they are worth saving, let him prove it. Elias didn't wait for further argument. He grabbed his medkit and moved to the first Kael'vara, a young soldier with a plasma burn searing through his side. The alien flinched as Elias touched him. That you're wasting your time, human, the warrior rasped. Elias applied a stabilizer. That's not your call to make. The Kael'vara hissed, but pain forced him still. Another Zorvith soldier scoffed. Why save an enemy? Elias finished the wound dressing and glanced up. Because wounded soldiers aren't fighters. They're just people who need help. The room was silent. Then Krezek spoke again. And what will you do, doctor, when your mercy costs you everything? Elias wiped his hands, his heart pounding. That we'll find out soon enough. That night, as the war raged outside the camp, something else changed. Zorvith soldiers watched him now. Not as a prisoner, not even as an asset, but as something else. Something dangerous. That a healer who dictated the fate of warriors. That a human who was reshaping their war. The sky was burning. Elias stood at the edge of the Zorvith war camp, staring at the battlefield beyond. The Kael'vara had launched their final assault at dawn, a desperate, reckless push to break the Dominion's grip on the planet. Now, bodies littered the ground. Zorvith Kael'vara, and those unlucky enough to be caught between them, and Elias was trapped in the middle of it all. His medical tent was overflowing. Wounded soldiers from both sides lay on crude cots, groaning in pain as his makeshift team scrambled to keep them alive. blood red, black, and iridescent, soaked his uniform that he had never stopped to ask himself what exactly he had become more than just a doctor. When had his battlefield triage turned into command? When had he started giving orders that even the Zorvith followed? When had he become the one deciding who lived and who died? But the war didn't care about his questions. It had already given him an answer: you are necessary, and that was more terrifying than anything else. General Krezek entered the tent, his heavy footfalls shaking the ground. He surveyed the wounded Kael'var prisoners lying beside Zorvith warriors, both being treated without discrimination. Elias didn't stop working. That you're playing a dangerous game, Doctor, Krezek said. Elias didn't look up. I thought you liked games. You're still alive because of me, aren't you? The general's mandibles twitched in what might have been amusement. The Kael'vara are falling back, Krezek said. We will crush them by nightfall. Elias exhaled slowly. He knew what that meant. No survivors, no prisoners. The war would end in a massacre. Elias set his tools down. He turned to face Krezek, ignoring the sharp ache in his exhausted limbs. Call for surrender. Krezek blinked. What? You've already won, Elias said. The Kael'vara know it. They're fighting because they think you won't let them live. Give them a way out. Krezek chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. You assume we want them to live? Elias took a step closer, meeting the general's gaze without flinching. I saved your men. I saved you. And now, I'm asking for something in return. A long silence. Then Krezek leaned in. You think your mercy will change anything? Elias's hands curled into fists. I think I already have. The ceasefire came at dusk. The Kael'vara war leader, bloodied and exhausted, stood across from Krezek in the war camp, surrounded by what remained of his forces. He had expected death. He had expected slaughter. Instead, he found a human doctor standing between him and oblivion. Elias stepped forward. This war is over, he said, voice firm. You don't have to die for it. The Kael'vara war leader looked at him, then at his wounded warriors lying in the medical tent. Zorvith medics stood beside them, applying what they had learned from Elias. Enemies, treating enemies, something that shouldn't have been possible, and yet it was happening. The war leader exhaled sharply. You are a strange creature, human. Elias managed a weary smile. I get that a lot. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the Kael'vara dropped his weapon. His warriors followed, and just like that, the war ended. Not with fire, not with blood, but with something far more powerful than a choice. Did I end the days that followed? Whispers of the human doctor who ended the war spread across the stars. Some called him a hero, some called him a fool, but all of them knew one thing: humanity had arrived, and they would never see them the same way again.